share ideas of what anarchists do. If you're an anarchist and you're doing something you think is prefigurative, I'd love to hear some of those examples. Go ahead.
I guess my name's Ethan, and one of the things that I think that before we even talk about organizational tactics, like anarchists at meetings, and I don't know what everybody's experience is, it might have just been really bad, but just you can make the group not shut up.
Could you talk up a little bit?
I think that one of the basic, like, I'll stay seated. I just think that one of the basic things that people need to do is whenever having a meeting to discuss like that organizational tactic that you're talking about, is just like making the group that you're not going to get too attached to what you're saying in case maybe you're wrong, and also just not to shout at one another. Like that seems to be something that's very basic that I've seen not play out all that well. Just people just yelling.
So a good prefigurative practice I've seen recently from that anarchists do is they set up ground rules at the beginning of a meeting, which are basically the idea of what we want to abide by while we're in this space to make decisions.
So my name's Josh. I think there's a lot of talk, I think, in like theory of like this whole host of practices that you can kind of umbrella under like non-branded tactics or practices. It's been used, that word's been around a lot. But I mean, everything from things like critical mass and food not bombs, and I mean, you could even say book fairs now might be a non-branded practice, where it's very easily, at least it's a basic model that's easily replicated, but can take different forms in different places to meet the needs. But it's like one of those that I've been involved with is community bike spaces, and in itself, bikes aren't necessarily, revolutionary or radical, but it can definitely be an area where approaching bikes as like a sustainable form of transportation and looking at it as a commodity that can be decommodified coming from a radical standpoint. And we have so much surplus in the U.S. and first world nations that there's so much things like bikes that they're in the trash. They're so easily found, and we can then fix them up and teach people how to work on them, and so that can be empowering in a way. And then also approach the organization of that group from a non-hierarchical standpoint and collectively organize. And then, one thing that I've seen that's really interesting is the people who sometimes are coming there to fix up their bike because they want to ride to work or they want to just enjoy exploring their neighborhood in a different way other than by car, then may become involved with the space. And so it kind of can expose people to alternative or radical ways of working or organizing that maybe they hadn't seen before.
Someone else hasn't spoken before, the examples? Just looking for examples of prefigurative practices among anarchists.
Is anyone here familiar with Drupal?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a open source software development, and there's three aspects that were brought up by the person who invented Drupal at the recent conference that were just beautiful and very anarchic. He didn't invent them all, but I just want. And this is basically under the category of organizing to do work. One is the concept that planning becomes coordination when you have communication. So you require somebody who's in charge when something requires so much planning ahead of time in order for it to happen. Because obviously if you're following a plan but you didn't make the plan, you feel disempowered. But if you have, with the internet, for example, everybody's able to stay in touch with everybody else no matter where they live. You can now coordinate and outperform people who've been doing the planning. That's the first aspect. The next is in the private sector, like Microsoft wants to make software, they have to hire a whole bunch of people and everybody's a hired person at Microsoft and that's what they do all day long. In open source, not only just Drupal, everybody can contribute a little bit because it's something they do a little in their off time. And if you imagine a graph of how much everybody is contributing to the project, in Microsoft it would be like this, right? Everybody who's hired and then the people who aren't hired who now have no access to the code at all. In open source it's like this, very, very long tail, lots of people doing just a little bit, but there's so many people doing just a little bit that it actually has more area under the curve. So that's the second piece. And the third is the opposite of a meritocracy, it's a worktocracy in the sense is that the more you do, the more you have access to do and the more you're recognized. Even if you're not doing it as well as some of the people who do it really, really well. So there's something very, very open about that. So just 3 practices.
Other examples that?
Can I ask you a question about that?
Why don't you ask?
Okay, later on.
I'm just feeling like, sorry, there's like
Okay.
7 or 8 minutes left. I want to make a pitch for the next workshop, which I don't know your name.
Let me make the pitch.
Okay, but I just really briefly is on the really, really free markets. So, which is another really good example of anarchistic practices. Other examples of?
Yeah, I'm involved with, my name's Nick, it's Nick Weston. I'm involved with animal rights, and there's a animal testing company, as many people know, called Huntington Life Sciences, it's HLS. And there's a thing people can do is, on certain days you can go to a website, and the website allows you to constantly send ping requests to one of their suppliers. You know, it could be a medical supplier, it could be a multi-class supplier, XYZ, you name it. And people, hopefully most people, or a lot of people can come together and go to this website on certain days and ping requests to suppliers, and it will crash their server. And the more people will do this, hopefully it's going to be successful. And you can find things like this in any media in different cities. And, you know, one person's not going to do shit. You can have like 1 million people requesting a ping request from this server, and you might shut it down. It might work.
I would actually say it's a good example of what things anarchists do, which are great. In a sense, it's like direct action or sabotage or stopping things from that we don't like. But in a way, it's something that I would put on the other side of it's us stopping things we don't like, as opposed to would we do that? Does that prefigure what kind of a world we want? Would we want to do that toward each other in a different society? And I would say
Right.
no, hopefully. But we might want to say indie media, your example, or uses of Drupal or websites for ways to envision us having more connectivity to each other, more ability to share resources. So the flip side of that is it might allow us to do things that now we feel are cross-global that might not be able to happen in a different world if we don't like certain forms of transportation or certain forms of, potentially, if we can make computers more sustainable and ecological. So that's what I think is hard, is how do we envision what we would want us to be doing in a different world? Not to diminish your example, it's a perfectly good practice that anarchists do right now to stop the things we don't like. But I'm trying to get at the thing is I think what we do really well and almost better is trying to imagine glimpses of a different world. Even as flawed as they are, even as great as the bike co-ops are, they're so great, bike collective, but they're still just partial examples because there's a bike co-op in my town, all little anarchists running around doing it, and everyone loves them now. You know, so they're getting like, all of a sudden people are like, oh cute, you know, and in a way they're kind of flipped out by that because they're like, they don't want it to be a little more subversive, and people love bikes now, you know, and that, but I think that's nice. I think it's nice. But again, it's like, it's an interesting thing where that tension between how do we prefigure and how do we also keep the edge that people get that we're trying to actually call for a different society at the same time. That's the trick. It's really tricky, a real trick, I think. Sorry, you.
I just want to follow up on what Josh said about your comments about bicycling, which sound like cute. Bicycling changes the perspective. In fact, I've been involved in critical analysis and a lot of the movements in the city. And in the city, it can change the way we look at space. So it can be like a revolutionary kind of prefigurative movement toward that ideal or the potential.
Yep.
So whereas you can think of it as like in a country, be like a silly thing, in the city it becomes really, really central. And it's a central movement in the city itself.
I would second that in terms of community gardens. I mean, it might not be particularly revolutionary in Vermont, but in the city, it changes
Exactly.
people. It very fundamentally changes people when they start growing their own food.
I think it does everywhere. I actually think anything we do that deals with people's basic things anywhere changes them. So it's because you relate to each other. I guess that's what I was talking before. How do you relate, when people start having to relate to each other differently, suddenly it's not your little private garden plot, it's, you have to figure out who's going to do, like where I live, I'm part of a community garden. Someone has to maintain a little solar water thing, and we all try to figure out how to do that together. And that's totally different than if I had my own garden and had to just worry about my own water. So really different fundamental wherever you live.